Well, good day. Welcome back to TVCC. It's been a while, but we're going to start covering the information in chapters 13 and 14. We're going to try to get back on track as fast as we can so we can complete the semester. On the screen, hopefully you're seeing the textbook so that we can go over the details. We're going to try to make sure we cover this as best we can. We had just finished up with part of the Renaissance, the early aspects, so now we're going into, as the title here says, the High Renaissance and Mannerism. So we're going to be talking about some of the details there, especially the art, the architecture, this is a phenomenal period during this time for those details. The little preview here gives you some details a little bit about Pope Julius and Michelangelo, who is brought into this. We're going to be discussing Michelangelo. We'll be discussing Leonardo da Vinci. We'll be discussing Raphael. So yes, we have already covered Donatello. Now we're going to cover the other three Mutant Ninja Turtles. So we're going to look at some of these details here. We had left off, of course, in the previous chapter, chapter 12, talking about the Black Plague that had gone through during the 1300s and basically had isolated people. We talked about how Boccaccio, with his Decameron, had written a work about 10 people who had chosen to, as we now call it, socially distant themselves from the plague. And during that time, they had locked themselves away in a country estate, and to pass the time for the 10 days that they felt necessary. Each told a story a day, so you have 10 people telling a story each for 10 days for a total of 100 stories, which is the Decameron. We had talked a little bit about the development of the monetary system. We had also talked about the focus on the building of the cathedrals and in different places, but also the movement from building cathedrals to more public buildings. We talked about how much of the art had really focused upon literary themes, but now was changing ever so slightly as you start having more details. And this is what we're going to start seeing, is talk about politics, popes, and patronage, so that you wind up having details. The Pope, one of the aspects we talked about was that the large churches that were built, especially in France, when we looked at the cathedrals there, such as at Chartres and Notre Dame in Paris, and Amiens, the Roman Church, based in Vatican City, of course, felt a little undersized. The older St. Peter's Basilica was a smaller church, and of course, the idea was that that should not be the case. So Julius II planned for an overhauling of the new cathedral and hired new people to start building it. We have a number of different individuals who wind up working as lead architect at different places, and one of those is Michelangelo, who is also brought in to originally to do some painting. As it says here in your book, Julius was a fiery man who did not hesitate to don military armor when he led his troops to battle, because he did that. What we see here, of course, in this map is the details of, again, there is no set Italy, and rather you have different areas, almost like the city-states that we had seen when we talked about Greece and the Greek culture. Well, now you have these. You have the Papal States. You have the idea of the Republic of Siena. We talked about Siena. You have the Republic of Florence, which you'll see is not only Florence, but also incorporates these other areas, such as Vinci and Pisa. Vinci is going to be an important aspect here. You have the different ones such as Genoa, Savoy. You have the Republic of Venice, which you'll notice actually moves over into other areas beyond just what we now think of as Italy. So we have those details that are offered for us. What we wind up seeing is that this is going to be a time when we have artwork really come to the forefront. These are some of the most famous of the artists that we have. The details that are offered here, among others, Leonardo da Vinci, the town of Vinci, where he's from, Michelangelo. You're going to have others as well, such as Bramante. They're going to be coming from Giotto, Donatello, Alberti, Masio, whom we've talked about previously. Da Vinci, of course, the name is well recognized. Leonardo is a figure who, many of his works do concern the religious aspects, and many of them are used for display in various religious areas, private chapels, monasteries, etc. This one, as it tells you, this is Madonna of the Rocks. The image of the Madonna is an important figure. We talked about how Mary becomes a lead figure. She is, and this is showing this idea about the structure, and again, how this referencing that we had talked about with Masio, especially where they wind up using the vanishing point, this idea about structure and geometry coming into play as a treatises on how artists need to construct their paintings. And this is an indication of Da Vinci using that geometric principle to create the images that we have here. We have the darker background, the focus on the image up front, and that becomes a key detail. Other of his famous paintings, this is in the St. Maria Refectory, the Last Supper as it's known. This particular painting has, it was a fresco painted on the wall and is not in as good a shape as we would like. It's had to be restored a couple of times. But the details here, you have the disciples all on these. So you have 6 on this side, 6 on that side, Christ at the center. The vanishing point works this way, so that literally there's the pyramid structure going here and here. You have the use of perspective that you can tell, so he is painting the side patterns here in smaller form on a slant to give an indication of distance. And you have the backdrop here also looking as if it is a distant aspect, so you get a sense of perspective that Da Vinci begins using. Perhaps his most famous painting, probably the most famous painting in the world, is the Mona Lisa. Again, this is one that has had a number of different suppositions and views about. And then, of course, you have his drawings, his collection of books, and this particular aspect can cause quite a bit of consternation at times. When you look at this, his detail, excuse me, it went back to that one. The drawing here is showing the gestation of the fetus, and the details here that he offers and the notes. And for a long time, his notebook threw people off because nobody could read it until it was finally recognized that essentially what he did, he wrote everything backwards. And if you hold this up into a mirror, you can actually then read it from the mirror. But this caused consternation because how does he know what the fetus looks like on the inside of a woman's stomach? How does he know what the fetus is curled up, what shape it is in the womb? Well, of course, there's no sonograms, no X-ray, nothing along those lines. And of course, what happens is that what is recognized is that Leonardo, among others, would have arrangements with local, we'll call them mortuary personnel, so that when a dead body would come in, he would sometimes get that dead body and then be able to do his autopsies and his detailing there. As it says here, if I can get down to this one, has no books. His sketches, he invented such things as flying machines, submarines. He has all sorts of detailed drawings in there. Knowledge of anatomy, as it says, is unsurpassed. His details there. Human fetus and lining of the uterus. And again, how would he know that's what it looks like in the uterus? Well, he probably was able to get hold of a cadaver of a pregnant woman, and in his autopsy and his detailings of that, he was able to make this drawing. What we also have is that Leonardo kept a number of notebooks and detailings there. This idea about printing this out, this idea about paper, is how he did. This was unique. Again, paper making goes back to China quite some time, but they had guarded that. Again, the Muslims who are given the details about that. We've covered it before. And so paper industry takes place for quite some time, but the Europeans do not get it for quite some time. A little bit later, it's going to take them some time. Next major painter that we're looking at now is Raphael. And again, Leonardo had his Madonna of the Rocks. This is Madonna of the Meadow. Again, an image of Madonna. Again, the clothing style is more contemporary for Raphael. And you have, of course, the baby Jesus, the toddler there. His other artwork quite often covers, this is a Pope Julius, who had commissioned Raphael to paint this one. And this is one of his most famous works. It's called The School of Athens. This is a large painting, 25 by 18, as it tells you here. The central figures are Plato and Aristotle. In the forefront here is Michelangelo. You also have Raphael painting himself in at one point, but this is the details that we have here. Again, Plato, Aristotle. You have other figures that are offered. You have the various individuals from different parts of the globe. You have the studies going over here. You have the, this is Michelangelo, as I said. You have the Islamic heritage of education taking place, as the figure represents that. He is trying to show that they're drawing, this is Michelangelo, which gives us an indication. It's one of the few representations that we actually have, so we know how Michelangelo looked. He was a contemporary of Raphael's, and so Raphael paints him into it. We have close-ups here, and again, this is his self-portrait, so that when you look here, and if I can get that to be full size again, we have it here. You can see that Raphael has placed himself into this picture, and he has also offered, again, that idea of the sense of perspective. You can see the triangulation that is used, so that you have the figures emerging here, so that your attention is generated in that way. Figures to the forefront are larger. As you move further back, they get smaller to get that sense of perspective. You have the idea about the background also collapsing, if you will, to a smaller size to give a sense of proportion and ratio. This is a key aspect that we see within the artistic prominence of these artists of this era. Michelangelo, of course, also was an excellent sculptor. This is his Pieta, which is essentially the Madonna with the body of Christ in her lap. This is a carving that you can see is that the figure of Mary seems to be larger and more voluminous, if you will, than the body of Christ, but it creates a sense of perspective. I think we already talked about his image of David and this idea of the figure here that is in proportion and is a throwback to the Greek tradition. You have the contrapposto positioning of the legs, the idea about the clearly defined body. This is a very Greek tradition, and the high Renaissance artists, such as Michelangelo, were going back to that detailing, as well as inventing new techniques. This is his Moses, again, a carving, the idea of the rays of light, as it says, instead of horns. We have, in the paintings, of course, you have the images of the halos behind the heads to indicate the saintliness of those figures. With the sculptures, it's a little hard to put halos on, so instead they wound up using these figures here. They're supposed to be the corona, that glow, if you will, the rays emanating to show the saintliness of Moses. Perhaps his most famous work for Michelangelo, the paintings he did in the Sistine Chapel. He was basically ordered by Pope Julius II to do this. He spent a long time painting these scenes. He was on a scaffold, lifted up to the ceiling, and spent the time lying on his back to paint these. It is an immense work. It, over the centuries, became dirty because of smoke rising from incense being burned, other aspects being burned for lighting originally, and then later smoke from cigarettes and cigars went up to and discolored it. So they did a cleaning of it a few years ago to show the brighter colors. These are the details. This is the creation of Adam, and again you can see a very strong throwback to the Greek tradition and the images there. This painting caused some consternation. for a number of reasons. One, the nakedness of certain figures, but also another situation. This is God giving life to man. But when you look at the two figures, this became a problematic because the figure of God is not larger than the figure of Adam. And that raised a number of issues. This idea of God and man not being equal, but in his painting coming across that way. This particular section is 18 feet by 9 feet, so this whole ceiling is just a huge, huge work. You also have as part of it, and you can see that back here is the Last Judgment, where again you have the figure of the souls coming up and being judged, and some being condemned and sent to hell, others getting a chance to rise. And then this is his carving for Giuliano de' Medici, and we talked about the de' Medici family controls Florence. One of the figures who was brought into that eclectic and strongly humanities-oriented grouping of people that Lorenzo de' Medici accumulated was Michelangelo. And this is a carving he did for the tomb. As it tells you in your textbook here, the Virgin Mary and the Pieta is holding this idea about the proportions, so that the figure is smaller for Christ, but as if that body is leaning, so you don't necessarily get the full impression. His Michelangelo's David, as I said, is a throwback to the work of the Greeks. In this particular case, there was a piece of marble that had been abandoned because there was a flaw in it, and Michelangelo took that one piece of stone and worked on and created his David. It's over 17 feet tall. It's a huge figure. When we talk about Donatello's version, it was just around 5.5 feet tall total. So he did his on a massive scale. When you get a chance to look at that work, you'll see that in his painting on the Sistine Chapel, he develops a number of different aspects to it. And so you have the creation of Adam, as it mentions here. As it says, the linear grace, the display of emotion. It also shows this idea of God creating human, and you have the hand of God sparking him. But you also have the idea of the completion of the act here. This style is part of the Last Judgment, painted on one of the walls there, where he put his religious vision. It tells you here about Charles V having sacked Rome, the church having gone through a number of different issues, including the Protestant Reformation, which we'll be getting to soon. And then it talks a little bit about the Medici chapel and the sarcophagi that he sculpted there. This is the Pieta again, and what happened is that an individual jumped over and attacked, and you can see here the arm of the Madonna being damaged. Someone literally attempted to destroy it, struck the figure. It says here 12 times, knocking off her left hand and arm, smashing her nose, the back of her head, so that 100 marble fragments. What eventually was decided, that it was restored to look like the original using integral restoration, reattaching pieces that they could, filling in with missing pieces with their equivalent. Restores piece together the chunks and fragments. A tourist who was in the basilica picked up a piece as they were arresting Toth, and so he had to mail that one back. But they restored it so that it is now functional. This is, as it says in 1506, he commissioned a new St. Peter's. Bramante comes in as the lead architect. He eventually is replaced by others. And it does not get finished until 1590. But this is St. Peter's, the large opening area. This is where the Pope, if you saw it last week, the Pope was sitting out in front of St. Peter's before the courtyard area, with no one there, offering a prayer for our world. This design, of course, is a throwback to some of the Roman and Greek traditions, and they use that. You'll see this idea of the floor plan. Again, what we talked about here is that cross structure that is very common in the churches, but it also has the floret image that is used in a number of different areas. This is one of the other churches Bramante designed, where he had his plan. And this, again, you'll see the use of the columns, the idea of the doming that was very typical of Roman, the use of the friezes there that they had imported from the Greeks. This gives you a little bit better of the piazza, the plaza in front. And again, the other day, this is where the Pope was sitting out in front, leading a prayer. And this is where typically you would have, on the high holy seasons, Easter is the next closest one, you would have hundreds of thousands of people gather, lining and filling this entire area. The statues go all the way around here. You can see in the video that I have posted for you that is just a really good series of videos. There's 3 that you'll get a much closer image of this. Again, the Michelangelo wound up becoming a lead architect, the chief architect in 1547. And so he came back to the central doming, which eventually is finished in, as it says, much later. You have the plans that Michelangelo draws out, and Bernini will actually complete the front of the basilica. Bernini is one of those modern, sets up modern architecture in a number of ways. So you have the details here about how Michelangelo worked for 6 different popes over 60 years, doing what was appointed of him, and he's one of those individuals who just was remarkable. Venice is another one of the city-states. We've talked about Florence, we've talked about Siena. Venice is another one of these city-states that takes over a number of areas, and they also become very prominent with their architecture and their art. This is Palladio, who was, as it says here, the leading architect in northern Italy. Well, he was born in Vicenza is not certain, it says, but that's when they claimed him. He has a number of the buildings. Again, you'll see that this building is very similar in the format to what we saw with Greek and Romans in the earlier chapter. You have the large open porch, you have the use of the column, the friezes, the cornice here, the doming effect, the archways for the windows. This is very traditional of what we saw with Roman. As it says here, takes prototypes from antiquity and symmetry and temple front. It is not derivative, though. He used that mathematical system that we saw with the artists and their use of mathematics to delineate the triangulation of figures and using for the vanishing point. Architecture comes into play as well. I have probably mentioned before, and for those of you I've had in classes before, if you're going to be an architect, you have to study math. You have to study art. You have to learn art techniques and drawing. You have to study a number of different areas. And this is one of the aspects that Palladio winds up using, the idea about harmony and balance. The Renaissance going back to those classical ideals that we had seen in ancient Greece and Rome. You have painting also. They begin looking more for landscape. They move a little bit further away from the traditional, the more religious figures, and go back to some of the more classical. This is Titian's Venus, where he, of course, is paying. This is called Venus of Urbino, because probably paying for the Duke of Urbino. You have the use again of a prominent figure here. You have little touches such as the dog here, the idea of the young girl back here looking through. You have a number of different figures where, again, the eye can go different places. You have contrast and shading and coloring. The lighting that is used, the detailing in the background, as you see here. All that is part of what we're expected to see, and as it says here, the delicate flower petals, the rich brocade that we see here. Contrast between the drapery and the lighting, so that you get this shift in the eye moving as you look at the painting. What this style becomes known as is called mannerism, where they are trying to sometimes distort and elongate figures, flattening those out, not necessarily using balance or a defined focal point, but instead trying to create something else. This gives you an image of protormos, entombment, and again, we'll see that the figure of Christ, who probably should be the figure that is most important, it's the tomb of Christ, is actually off to one side. Proportions are not necessarily in light. This individual's legs do not seem to match up with this individual's legs. That's part of the modernists, as they're trying to convey the emotion of the topic, not necessarily trying to create other aspects. As it says here, the movement swirls around. You have the weightlessness, distortion, and ambiguity of space, where you have some of the bodies and limbs are elongated. Their heads are smaller in proportion. And this becomes part of what we see in this aspect of this new style that's developed. Rosino does the same here with his view about, again, a very classic subject, in this case, again, Venus. And you can see where it talks over here about the idea about folly, which is over here. Casting roses at the couple. You have hatred and constancy here and here, who are jealous of the detail of Venus. Again, with the mannerisms, we wind up with some other individuals. This is Fontana, and this is one of the interesting aspects that we've talked about. We don't always hear, we hear about the great male instructors, but we do not always hear about the artists of this era, but we don't always have the rise of prominence of the females. Lavina Fontana is one of those really strong artists of this era, who is often overlooked. As it tells you here, the daughter of an accomplished painter in Bologna. She traveled and trained. She writes, this is a painting called Nole Mi Tangere, and this line is actually going to be used a century, well, somewhat later, by, excuse me, I'm trying to highlight that, but it's not going to work. This is actually going to be used as a line in a poem by Sir Thomas Wyatt when he writes one of his most famous poems, and we're going to be getting to the English poets here soon. But he writes about a figure, and this line is actually quoted, recalling this painting. And again, what we have here is this idea that, as it says here, the risen Christ in the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene, where Jesus is saying, "Do not touch me," and this is the image you're supposed to have here. Again, Mary Magdalene with there's our little aurora, our halo effect, and this is an image of Christ. But you'll see that Fontana uses very contemporary figures to convey this. You have the approach to the tomb here, where the angel is saying to convey to the women. The idea of the background here, you see that it's a much more contemporary feeling of the Italian setting rather than what would have been the first century in Jerusalem. And so, as it says here, this focus, you have Jesus risen from the dead. She drops to her knees, but he rejects her touch. And so you have, again, looking at something here that is a very contemporary view for her audience, but is still conforming to that religious sentiment. Likewise, what we have again are some different views as well. You have another woman artist, this idea of Sophonisba Angulissola, and she had traveled somewhat, had gone to the service court portraits, and portraiture becomes really more important during this time. You're going to have some of the Flemish artists who become portraits. This is a throwback somewhat to Da Vinci. The Mona Lisa is considered a portrait that he did, probably of a middle-class businessman's wife. But we have here this idea about using something other than just religious ideas to convey. And so it says here, Angela Sola was one of the earliest women artists to become internationally renowned. But we don't talk too much about these figures. These are not the ones that we really recognize anymore. But she was very important. As I said, becoming the court painter for Philip II in Spain was really a very important aspect. It is one of those aspects that we just don't always understand and recognize. This is Tintoretto. It says here, one of the last of the giants. Jacopo Robusti, better known as Tintoretto. His father was an individual who was Tintore, so he is Tintoretto, the little dyer. This is his Last Supper, very different from what we see with Leonardo's. We have again Jesus here, and notice though that it also uses much more of the sfumato technique, the idea of the darker aspects and tones where the figures blend into that. If you go back and look at the Mona Lisa, Da Vinci was really key in using sfumato, the idea of S-F-U-M-A-T-O, where you use the figure and the background sort of blending together into a darkness, and we have this off here by Tintoretto. It says here, this develops a style concept has developed over the course of this. Leonardo's symmetry, where you have the balance. If you go back, Jesus is in the center. You have 6 disciples on one side, 6 disciples on the other. Well, now we have not quite handled in that way. And rather, you're catching a moment that Jesus is sharing this with the bread and wine. When he announces one will charge him to repeat this in memory of him, as opposed to Leonardo when he has just announced that one of the disciples who are there with him will betray him. Well, this is a very different perspective on the Last Supper, Tintoretto's, as opposed to Leonardo, which you have the disciples in Leonardo's Last Supper moving off and whispering to one another. Well, this one, as it says, you have the idea about life, the communion, sense of communion, where this whole image, you have people everywhere, motion and movement all being depicted for you. Giovanni da Bologna, again from Bologna, is what we have here. Born in Flanders, he was really not Italian, but he comes to Italy, and there he moves to Florence, where he becomes part of the de Medici court. And this is the rape of the Sabine women, based upon an ancient Roman story. And again, the sense of movement, perspective, the idea of the use of the technique that was very typical of the Greek and Roman, where you see these details and the sense of the anatomy being offered. And again, he's not worrying about using a technique for the church. This was not going to be on display in any cathedral, not in any chapel. This instead was meant as a private piece that was going to be part of a household and displayed there. So Giovanni da Bologna is an important aspect. Michelangelo, of course, also designed, he did not just do art in the sense of sculpture and painting. He also, as we know, became the lead architect for St. Peter's, and he did a number of the designing. This is the vestibule for the Laurentian Library, where it's part of San Lorenzo in Florence. And he constructs it. We see the Mannerist art, the idea about the two-sided and the lack of proportion here, where you have the curved steps on this side and the straighter steps here, so that nothing is proportional in that way. They don't mimic one another. You have different styles until you reach a sense of commonality at the top. So the staircase connects the vestibule to the reading library. He breaks from the geometry of the walls to curving lines, organic shapes, the rippling of it as you move out this way, and then the other side here. And so this, again, a key aspect where we have Michelangelo experimenting, if you will, with mannerism, with not trying to follow a linear perspective, but distorting it, moving it, adapting it into a different way. Music is also part of this. As I mentioned just before the break in our class when we were covering, music was primarily had been used for services and was religiously oriented. The idea of the Gregorian chant, of course, goes back. The idea about only male voices singing. The idea about instrumental music sometimes being used. As it says here, popes were known to enjoy music outside. But what we wind up with is music becomes different. The de Medicis, for instance, commissioned works of music to be written for them. Polyphony comes along. Instead of having the sense of just the unison, you're going to have multiple notes with multiple voices being carried through. Palestrina is one of the leading figures here who does so. He writes for both church and also secular purposes. As it says here, the harmony and perfect balance of the voices creates a smoothness of texture. It really is a purity of style, as again says here. He wind up having a number of works in it. Hans Pfister in the 19th and 20th century, wind up writing an opera to honor Palestrina's genius. It's a really key aspect and key artist with music. Venetian music comes along in other ways. Dutchman comes along as the choir master. And so you wind up having influences there. So you have what's taking place in Rome with the popes authorizing music. Then you have Venice with its music, and you start having this idea coming along where, as it says here, the Roman tradition, you have a sense of proportion, classism, balance. Venice composers, though, are interested in more color and ornate aspect to it, the idea about allowing emotion to come through. So you wind up with the choir singing against each other, so you have a voice singing one note and another side coming in a different way. Literature is also prominent during this time. One of Castiglione in his book of the Courtier, where he tries to explain this is what you need to do to be a gentleman. Da Vinci writes in his notes, as it says here, notes were on mathematics with geometric drawings, illustrations that he offered. He came up with, as it says here, 720-foot long bridge that he offered, and war machines such as a tank, what would have been a tank. And the Turkish government actually used his design to build a bridge. So he did a number of different works, including these details. Same thing with Michelangelo, who had come through with a number of different areas, and as I said, was part of the architecture school. Colonna comes along, and this is an interesting figure. She writes poetry, and if I can get that to come up here, there we go. This is one of her sonnets, and it says, "Once I lived here in you, now my now blessed light, your soul joined to mine, for you were kind. Each to the dear one had life resigned, and dead to self that only lived aright. Now that you, being in that heavenly height, I no longer grace such joy to find, your aid denied not to a faithful mind against the world which arms with us to fight. Clear the thickness which all around me lie, that I may prove it flying for your wings on your already traveled heavenward way. The honor yours, if here miss lying things, shut my eyes to joys which soon pass by, to open them there to true eternal day." And again, this idea about, it says here, her writings, her husband had died in battle, and so we have, as it says, nearly 400 poems idolizing her husband, looking back at her life. And this particular one, of course, is dedicated to him, and the idea that she hopes to be with him later as they move along. As it says, "I shut my eyes to joys which soon pass by, to open there to true eternal day," that she would join him one day as he has gone to heaven. She's an interesting figure. And again, you have Colonna was actually a close friend of Michelangelo's, had written a number of letters that we have. He had also written poetry, and you have some details here where she wrote that your art has brought you such fame that you perhaps never believed that this fame could fade with time. But the heavenly light has shone to your heart and shown you that, however long earthly glory may last, it is doomed to suffer the second death. He writes back, basically in poetic form, "I know full well that it was a fantasy that made me think that art could be made into an idol or a king. But all men do this, they do it half willingly. The loving thoughts, so happy and so vain, are finished now. A double death comes near. The one is sure, the other is a threat. And so you have these exchanges that they did, and they're really very lyrical when you look at them. Castiglione comes along and says he's best known for his book called The Book of the Courtier, in which he explains this is what you need to be if you're going to be a gentleman. Castiglione is in plays of Ben Jonson and Hamlet, where you have certain aspects written. It's written as a dialogue where he discusses how you should be a chivalrous person, the idea about the virtues that a true member of a court should possess. It also talks about this idea about being the universally well-rounded person, umo universale, that you should do so with a spensuratura, that it should seem effortless to you to know about art, to know about literature, to do feats of athletics. Everything should come through as if you're not having to try. It's just part of who you are. He also deals with women and this idea that we have here. It says that men, he has an argument with the characters in it where you have that women should imitate men not because of masculine superiority, but instead they should desire to gain their freedom, shake off the tyranny that men have imposed on them by their one-sided authority. And so the Magnifico, one of the characters created, argues that women are as capable as men of understanding worldly affairs. And again, we've talked before that the political structures of the times, going back to ancient Greece and other areas that we've seen in China and even in the other areas of the Far East, it always comes down to men being in charge, but that is due to a lack of potatoes, as I told you before. But again, what we have here is just some really interesting remarks about what women can be and they should be. The Magnifico, Giuliano de' Medici, argues that you advance a very feeble argument for the imperfection of women, that man cannot be more perfect than the female, since both the one and the other are included under the species of man, meaning mankind. To say that man is more perfect than woman, if not as regards essence, then as well as regard action, to this reply, these actions must be the properties either of the body or the mind. If you mean the body, well, because man is more robust or quick and agile, I say that this is an argument of very little validity, since among men themselves, those who possess these qualities more than others are not more highly regarded. It says that everything man can understand, this is a key point, women can too. Where a man's intellect can penetrate, so along with it can a woman's. And this is very heretical, this idea that women were as capable as men. And so we have this aspect that's offered. And so you have this detail. So Gaspari, trying to argue that men are superior, says, without exception, everyone wants to be a man. And Magnifico, again, Giuliano de' Medici is the figure he creates, implies that poor creatures do not wish to become men in order to make themselves more perfect, but to gain their freedom, shake off the tyranny. Well, quote that I read to you earlier. And again, that's a very forefront thought laid out by Castiglione. And again, this whole idea is that at the forefront of a feminist movement, if you will, that we're going to see eventually flower and move and develop, but it's going to take centuries before it reaches any fruition. So you have the play coming through again at different times, and so you have again more painting, and you have the courtier was not exclusive to males, rather you have the courtesans, which becomes a little less well received of a figure. Courtesans were sought after companions and entertainers and may have engaged in sexual liaisons. Eventually, the courtesan became more of the mistress of high-ranking nobles. And it tells you a little bit about the history of the geisha, the Japanese courtesans. And it tells you some details here about this aspect. And that this idea of courtesanship may have come in, it's not excluded to just the European, but other cultures had as well. And so this becomes part of a history in this way. Geisha meaning entertainer, trained in classical music, dance, vocal performance, conversation, rituals such as serving tea. But some do become idea about regard as more along the lines of mistresses for their sexual favors. But that's not really how the courtesan was established in its earlier formation, if you will. It's an original state. You have Veronica Franco in Venice, and she was an individual who was really a schooled individual. You can see her details here where she writes, warning to a mother concerning turning her daughter into a courtesan, saying you may not want to do this because of what, if these worldly concerns you add those of the soul, what greater doom and damnation could there be? That although she was a courtesan, she says not always what one would want. And so she wanted to protect the women who work as prostitutes in this way, that the sordid life of the courtesan, which quite often it would turn into. And so she writes this aspect here. We have Cellini, again, in the 16th century, and his work. So we see, again, throwback to the classical formation of the statue here, Perseus, and subject matter. Perseus with the head of Medusa, the idea of the contrapposto, the idea of the anatomical aspects that are part of it. Cellini was not a courtier. He was an individual who sort of a scoundrel in a number of ways. Tells you some details here. He had to flee Rome because he murdered someone. He was one who had some really bold ideas and views, but he was also a very talented artist in a number of ways. This idea about the casting of the bronze statue here, you start with a model, usually in wax or clay, then it was transferred into bronze. Cellini's casting of Perseus involved a series of accidents that took a while before it became perfected. And so you have Cellini in his autobiography where he talks about this. They cast the head of Medusa, and it came out very well. And very hopefully I brought the Perseus toward completion. The idea about this being fitted together. The wax Perseus was very impressive. It seemed to be wonderful, but it just didn't seem as if it's going to work. And so he explains that, again, to his patron, the Duke, how this was going to work and what he felt it would do. I rebuilt the furnace, made it very different from any other. So he literally designed a new oven for this one, to do this one. And he goes on, and it says that he can do this. Now, see, my lord, if your excellency understood this art as you claim to, then you wouldn't be worried about that head not succeeding. But you're right to be anxious about the right foot, which is so far down. And so instead, he suddenly makes the Duke become very angry at this because he's doubting if the Duke really understands art as well as he should have. When it came to the foot of Perseus, which had not come out, just as I predicted, he was filled with astonishment. He described to the Duchess how I told him this beforehand. And so then you have these details offered about Cellini, and that he understood his art far better than the Duke did. And the artists have these ideas. At the end of the chapter, of course, you have this summary here, the details here that are offered with Sir Thomas Hobby, his translation of the Book of Courtier from Italian to English in 1561. You have the choir of the Sistine Chapel being established in the 15th century. You have about Leonardo, the details here. You have Michelangelo, the dates and details here. The idea about Pope Julius setting up his Julian choir. Willart, who became the choir master in Venice, using the polyphony and the idea about contrapposto positioning of choirs as well, where you have one group singing against the other. You have Titian and his painting, Tintoretto and his views. His Last Supper very different from Leonardo's. Palestrina, you have Fontana, the idea about Bologna and the adoption of the Sabine women, the throwback with Cellini and Bologna to the idea of the classical Greek images and storylines of the ancient Greeks and Romans. We're going to be getting to Luther. We haven't covered that yet. That'll be coming up. And the other changes that are taking place here as well. And so you have these details here that are offered for us. And again, we have covered the chapter. We'll be covering some more details here momentarily. I'll be doing another recording for chapter 14. And we're going to also try having Zoom meetings. I'll be sending you a note about when I've scheduled the Zoom meeting. Now, currently, I'm looking at trying to have the Zoom meeting on probably Tuesday and maybe Thursday, beginning around 11 or 11:30, probably 11:30, so that we can sort of. I know that the Tuesday Thursday class that fits in with their time. For the Monday Wednesday classes, that may be a little awkward for you, but we'll see if we can record it, or if I can set up a separate Zoom for the Monday Wednesday classes. We're just going to see how that goes. After you watch this video and you hear this comment, if you're not going to be able to have a Zoom conference with me on a Tuesday Thursday around 11:30, and we'll keep it to about 30 minutes, I can try to reschedule one for us maybe on Monday and Wednesdays as well. Not this Monday, of course, today, but I can probably try to schedule this one for a Wednesday. Again, I hope that everything's going well. I hope you're fine, and we're going to just jump right back into all of this.